Welcome back in, everybody. Sports Take, JAKIB Sports YouTube Network on this Tuesday. Hope you're doing well. Appreciate you hanging with us. He's Derek Gunn. I am Rob Ellis. Excited to talk to our next guest. We haven't spoken to Jimmy in a little bit, really since predating the draft. So we got a lot of ground to cover with him. He does an awesome job. Eagles writer for Philly Voice. You can follow him on Twitter at Jimmy Kempski. James, what's going on, my man?
Apparently, I'm good. How are you,
Jim? Have you been spending time on the sun? I mean, what is you're a little red, buddy?
Yeah, been trying to enjoy the nice weather here, getting out, like running, walking, stuff like that. And yeah, there are some days where I forget to bring or to put on sunscreen, and this is the result.
I hear you. I'm see-through, so I can appreciate it. Trust me. So I wanted to hit a couple things. Derek and I were just kicking this around prior segment before you jumped on. What do you think about the flex thing now on with Thursday Night Football?
I hate it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
You can have the floor. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, from a selfish perspective, I mean, I'm looking to book my travel for the year. Yep. Now, like right around now is when I could. It's the cheapest you're going to get flights and stuff like that. And, you know, to find out in November that a game in December is going to now move from Sunday to Thursday, that's not easy to change a lot of times. And if you have kids and you have whatever, and again, this is just from a selfish perspective. I mean, there are people that are, you know, maybe planning on going to, one road. Whenever I fly to road games, those planes are packed with Eagles fans. Out of Philly, I fly out of Newark pretty often. They're always packed with Eagles fans out of Newark. And there are a lot of, I mean, anytime I go to an opposing stadium, usually in my hotel around the stadium, Eagles fans all over the place. So they absolutely travel. And, I think a lot goes into those trips, them, setting aside that time to go out and travel out to the West Coast or whatever it is. Like this year, they're going to be playing in Seattle in December. I imagine that's going to be a popular trip. That could very well get flexed into Thursday night, So to have to, force people to scramble and change their plans and all that. And I understand it. Like Amazon paid the NFL a lot of money to have to have these Thursday night games. And I just like the NFL to kind of just be honest and say, look, they paid us a lot of money to have these games. We kind of have to give them good ones. We can't guarantee that at the beginning of the year. And frankly, we care more about their money than people that buy tickets to go to the game. So that's what it is. And that's clearly what it is here, is they care more about Amazon's money than they do about people that buy tickets to actually attend games in the stadium.
Jimmy, were you surprised that the owners had the majority vote they needed, like right out of the gate? Because when you listen to tomorrow from New York, the Giants, I thought there would be more owners that would be on his side. I thought there would be more of a split, that this would be something that they would kind of review down the road again, maybe at the next owners meeting. I was shocked that they got 24 votes right out of the gate for this.
They got the exact minimum they needed, which was 24. And Jeffrey Lurie was one of the owners that voted for it. So it'll be interesting to see if there's a competitive advantage for some team down the line, and fans and reporters for those teams can say, had the owner of the, your team voted against this, they would not have this competitive disadvantage right now as a result of this game being flexed from Sunday into Thursday. But I'm with you. Usually when you make a change like this, kind of gets batted, around a little bit before it finally passes. But you're right, it passed on the first try, and it's a little disappointing. I think that Jeffrey Lurie voted in favor of this.
Now the other one, Jim, and it's clearly the I'm going to call it the 49er rule. Is the third quarterback thing here, because it really since the second that game ended, the crying and whining. I mean, it's a river. I mean, it's insanity. It's Noah's Ark. But they did get it passed, I think, in large part because of their complaints.
Sure.
Look, I'm fine with it ultimately, but let's call it what it is. If that game doesn't happen that way, there's no way this rule gets passed, right?
The rule is fine. Like, I don't have a problem with the rule to add the emergency quarterback thing to it. And you don't want to have what happened in that game happen. But you're right. I mean, had they not whined and complained for the past 4 months, it probably wouldn't have. And like, I think a counter argument to this would be, the Lions were the ones that proposed this rule change. Come on, give me a break. The impetus for this rule change was what happened to, not to the 49ers, but what happened in that game with they couldn't block the Eagles pass rush. They couldn't protect their quarterback. Protecting the quarterback is kind of a big deal in the NFL, and they couldn't do it. Their quarterbacks kept taking hits. 2 of them got knocked out. They didn't have any left. And that's how games can go sometimes. It's rare, but if you can't protect your quarterback, you're at the risk of having, your guys get hurt. And that's what happened. And, I don't think anyone outside of San Francisco feels well, I guess that's maybe not true. I've seen a lot of support for like, how that game might have gone differently had those quarterbacks not gone down on a national level, which I don't agree with. I think the Eagles pretty much dominated that game. But in terms of that rule change, it's funny just how it kind of went down, because you look back at 2019 when Carson Wentz got speared by Jadeveon Clowney, got concussed, got knocked out of that game. Josh McCown goes in, tears a hamstring. Normally you have to come out of that game, but they didn't have anyone left, so he had to play through that game on one leg. They lost that game. Like, they got nothing going on offense, of course, just like the 49ers got nothing going on offense against the Eagles. Eagles lost that game. Eagles actually kind of had a little bit more of a right to complain about that game because they lost their quarterback on a cheap shot.
Yeah.
Like, you didn't hear them complain at all.
No.
There was no rule change as a result of that game. They lost, basically 2 quarterbacks got hurt and they lost the game as a result of it. And they didn't complain about it. They just went out and they drafted Jalen Hurts and they ultimately got back to the Super Bowl.
Well, let me just real quick, Gunnar, on that, just to follow up. To me, if I'm John Lynch, I'm talking to Kyle Shanahan. I'm like, dude, enough. Like, you got to stop publicly because he's the king of this. It's Debo and it's everybody else too.
Yeah.
But every turn he gets, he cries about it. It's like, you got to move on, man. It's embarrassing.
It took him a little while because at first it was Debo and it was Brandon Ayuk and Jimmy Ward and Christian McCaffrey. Yeah, they're like their best players really were the ones doing the most complaining about it.
Yep.
And then at one point I started wondering, at what point does Kyle Shanahan step in and say, "Yo, shut up, guys! Like, enough already. Like, the game's over. We lost. Let's focus on the future." And then sure enough, Kyle Shanahan started kind of chiming in on the complaints, and it's like, okay, well, he doesn't care about the players complaining about it because he believes in all that nonsense too. And even John Lynch has, he hasn't sounded quite as complainy, but certainly he I think it was during the NFL Combine, he was mentioning about how the NFL needed to implement the emergency quarterback rule. So the phrasing, I don't remember if it was him specifically or not, but like, what happened to them? It's not what happened to them.
Don't put a tight end on Hassan Reddick. How about that?
Right. So it's just they've sort of escaped accountability for a lot of things that happened in that game, namely, having Tyler Kroft try to block Hassan Reddick, not challenging the incomplete pass to what should have been the incomplete pass to Devontae Smith. Made a lot of mistakes in that game from a coaching standpoint, and he sort of dodged accountability for that stuff and maybe placed a little more blame on the NFL not having that emergency quarterback rule. By the way, they didn't even have excuse me, I don't know if am I good? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That must be a headphone thing. I lost myself for a minute there. Well, I forget what I was saying there.
They didn't even have a third.
Oh, they didn't even have a third quarterback on their, not even forget their 53-man roster. They didn't even have it on their practice squad.
Right.
So even if there was a rule for them to be able to have an emergency quarterback, they didn't even have one on their 70-something man roster.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, so Jimmy, how do you address the game day roster now? Do you have a 47-man game day roster? I mean, because if you have a third quarterback, now that you have that leeway, you could be taking away a rotational position that's vital to your team, whether it's a corner, a safety, an edge rusher, an offensive lineman. How do you think they address the game day roster now?
So the way the rule is set up is you still send in your inactives as normal, an hour and a half before game time. And then if one of your inactives is a quarterback, that player can be your emergency quarterback. So you don't have to take another guy off the field. It's just an added position that can essentially dress on game day. So actually, from the Eagles' perspective, it's a good rule for them because they usually have 3 quarterbacks on their 53-man roster. Like even on a stacked roster last year, Ian Book was on their 53-man roster the entirety of the season. They never needed him. They never had to play or anything like that. But he remained on the 53-man roster every week. He was inactive every week except for the games that Jalen Hurts didn't play, and he was the backup to Gardner Minshew. But yeah, from the Eagles' perspective, this is a good role for them because they like to keep 3 quarterbacks anyway. And of course, This year it'll be Jalen Hurts and Marcus Mariota who are active. And then whoever wins the quarterback battle between Ian Book and their 6th-round draft pick, Tanner McKee, they'll have a camp battle. Whoever wins that, number 3 quarterback job will be the emergency quarterback on Sunday. So it's actually a rule that is ironically favorable to the Eagles going forward.
And to be clear, you can only tap into that third guy if there's injuries. This can't be, my starter stinks.
Correct.
And my backup isn't playing well. You can't do it that way. It's got to be the guy's out and not coming back.
Correct. The only difference is from back in the day, in terms of like what you're talking about there is like, so they had the emergency quarterback up until 2011, and then they didn't abolish it so much. They just said that extra roster spot you can just use on anyone. Let's just get rid of the emergency quarterback rule. You can use that roster spot on any position you want. But the way that it worked then was if you put your emergency quarterback in, the first 2 guys could not re-enter the game. That was it. They were done. So this time around, you can two guys have to get hurt, and then you can put your emergency quarterback in. But if a player who gets hurt is deemed fine to play again at some point, that guy is allowed to go back in.
Okay. Okay. It's good clarification there. Yeah, for sure. So let's dig into this, Jim. We have a good handle. We know how we will always make moves getting close to the regular season, but we have a pretty decent handle on what the roster is going to look like. Just from a roster standpoint, is they better on paper or worse? A little bit of a step back? What do you think?
I think it's a little step back. I mean, you can make an argument that they could potentially, I think it's obviously a really good roster still. It is clearly the best roster in the NFC. I think it's one of the most season ready rosters in the NFL. They have some holes, like linebacker, I think is a little shaky. You don't know what you're going to get. Having to Kobe Dean and Nicholas Morrow as your, projected starters there, and you don't have much depth behind those guys. I think they've done a good job at other positions, like at safety. They brought in an experienced vet in Terrell Edmonds. They go out and they draft Sidney Brown, who I think the team is pretty excited about. You have Reed Blankenship coming back. But you can make the argument that, they could be potentially worse along the offensive line because you lose Isaac Seumalo, and now you have Cam Jurgens and a rookie and Tyler Steen competing for that right guard spot. Jason Kelsey and Lane Johnson are each going to be a year older. You could potentially be worse along the defensive line. Of course, you draft Jalen Carter to be defensive tackle is a position that, can take a while for guys to kind of get their sea legs and become good players, which, I think we sort of equate that to the quarterback position. But you can always kind of equate that to defensive tackle too. Like the opposite of that would be like a running back where they can come in and play well right away. So we'll see what becomes of Jalen Carter, but the loss of Javon Hargrave on the interior of the defensive line, let's be honest, that hurts. He was a beast last year. You could make the argument maybe that they could be a little bit worse at corner. Again, for the similar premise at offensive line in that, Darius Slay is going to be 33 in January. James Bradbury is going to turn 30 at some point during the season. So those guys will be a year older. And of course, the injury luck that they had last year was really just incredible. They had everyone available, every player available for the Super Bowl, which is just kind of unheard of. So it's almost sort of a fool's errand to assume that they're going to have that same kind of luck again. But it's a good roster. I mean, obviously they're stacked with players that are all Pro Bowl caliber, at least 10 to 12 guys that you can kind of put in that category. And like I said, they're very clearly the best team in the NFC heading into the season.
Jimmy, you were talking about the cornerbacks, and when we talk about the cornerbacks, the one player we don't mention enough is Greedy Williams.
Yeah,
he's a pretty good cornerback. And how do you think they're going to use him? Do you think he'll play possibly safety and corner? Will he be like a Swiss Army knife, like a Malcolm Jenkins? How do you think they'll utilize this skill set?
Yeah, he's a tough one to kind of figure out how they'll use him because, I think he's pretty much an outside corner, really. And you look at their cornerback position, just the personnel they have there. I think you have 5 guys. I don't know that Greedy Williams is a lock to make the roster.
Really?
I'm with you. Yeah, I don't think he's a lock. He's got great size. He's 6'2". He runs a 4.37. So that's a good start from a cornerback right off the bat. But you have Slay, you got Bradbury, you got Maddox. There's, your top 3 guys. You got Keely Ringo, who's very clearly going to make the team. You have Zach McPherson, who has, at a minimum, made himself into a good special teams player. Hasn't really gotten the opportunity to play much because Slay and Bradbury have stayed healthy. And then Josh Jobe made the team last year. as an undrafted rookie free agent, to be determined if he can, crack the roster again in this season. So there's 6 guys right there that I just named, and I don't know if you can keep a 7th. So Greedy Williams will have to beat out at least, one of those guys. He had a rough season in 2022. So he lost playing time because he's playing behind Denzel Ward and I forget that Greg Newsome, who the Browns took in the first round.
Yep.
So his playing time was cut just because he was playing behind 2 first-round picks. And when he did get a chance to play, he was only targeted he had fewer than 100 snaps on the season, I believe. I think he had 70-something coverage snaps.
Mm-hmm.
Got targeted 8 times, gave up 7 completions, 150 yards, something like that, 2 touchdowns.
Oof.
So he got roasted when they tried. And actually, the one incompletion that went his way, I just did just this morning. It's funny you mentioned him. I just did a film breakdown of him I'm publishing on this weekend. So I just watched all these targets this morning. The one incompletion that the one pass that was incomplete on him really should have been a pass interference. He got dusted by T. Higgins. He just grabbed him and somehow they didn't call it. But it should have been pass interference. So I don't know. He's got everything you want in terms of traits, in that he's big and he's fast and he's got a high round pedigree. He was a former 2nd-round pick of the Browns. But I do think that it's not a guarantee he makes the roster. He's gonna have to beat out one of those 6 guys that I mentioned for a job.
Wow.
Well, yeah, wow, that's pretty deep stuff there, Jim. That's good. Good work out of you. So a couple other things I wanted to hit you with. If I said to you by the end of the regular season, the Eagles' best defensive tackle will be, how would you finish that sentence?
Oof, yeah. So when they re-signed Fletcher Cox to $10 million, I thought that was a little bit of an overpay. Certainly it was an overpay last year when they gave him 14. But I can kind of see why they did that now that we've seen the roster sort of shape up, because the other 5 interior defensive linemen that they have are all really young. So Milton Williams is 24. Jalen Carter's 22. Jordan Davis is 20. Or Jalen Carter might even be 21. Whatever. He's rookie. Jordan Davis is 2nd-year guy, 22. Moro Ojomo, who they took in the 7th round, is 21, I believe. Anyway, all these guys, even Marlon Tuipulotu, he's going into his 3rd year. He's 24. So you have all these really young guys. Fletcher Cox is the only player on this team, along the interior defensive line, who is a proven veteran at this point. So you don't know what you're going to get out of all these young players. Jordan Davis, in my opinion, sort of had he had his season kind of derailed mid-season when he got hurt against the Steelers. He got an ankle injury. He was starting to play better at that point. And then he comes back, and Linval Joseph has, kind of taken over his role as the run-stuffing, nose tackle on early downs. They had signed Ndamukong Suh when Marlon Tuipulotu goes down. So you don't really know what you're definitely going to get out of these younger players. So I think the most important player along the interior defensive line is, once again, Fletcher Cox. Mm-hmm. And we can see that his career is, in decline at this point. But again, he is the one guy that you kind of know what you're going to get from that interior defensive line spot. And I think, your expectations for the young guys to come out and perform are high, but it's no guarantee that they will.
Hey, Jimmy, I'm with you on one thing you mentioned earlier. I don't know what we're going to get out of the linebacking play. I mean, Nicholas Morrow, okay. Nakobe Dean, obviously, we know he excelled at the collegiate level, but as we also know, a lot of times it takes that college superstar to make a gradual transition to the pro ranks. And this is a team that had problems defending the middle of the field in the passing game all last season long. Mm-hmm. And I think when you look at the wealth of quarterbacks they're facing this year, the Patrick Mahomes, the Josh Allens, and so on and so forth, that's going to be an intriguing position to watch to see how that thing unfolds.
Yeah, Nakobe Dean, heading into training camp last year, I thought he had a chance to start. And then it became really clear early in camp that TJ Edwards was by far their best linebacker. And then Kaiser White was making plays in training camp, and it was clear that Nakobe Dean was going to start. Dean, for what he is, the player that he was at Georgia, he was just the smartest player on the field at the collegiate level. Not big. I mean, he's a smaller linebacker, of course, and he doesn't have good athleticism relative to, other NFL linebackers. So until he's sort of the smartest guy on the field, like he was in Georgia, he's going to have trouble being effective. Now, so his, transition from being, just a special teams guy in 2022 to becoming potentially the green dot guy, the guy that has like the defensive coordinator in his ear and is getting everyone lined up pre-snap. It's a big jump to go from, basically not playing in the regular defense at all to being like the guy who's, communicating with the defensive coordinator all game.
Yep.
We'll see. But he's a really smart kid, and we'll see if he can make that mental leap from last year into this year. And he's a really, really key player for them this year. That's kind of flying under the radar a little bit. I think once we kind of get around to training camp and we see how he's playing, maybe some of the concerns about the linebacker position are alleviated a little bit. But if he doesn't take a big leap forward, then I think that's going to be a big. They're not done adding to that spot, by the way. Like they only have 4 linebackers really on the roster. They have crazy. 6 total, but like 2 of those guys aren't going to make it. Like Davion Taylor, I've pretty much given up on at this point. And they have an undrafted guy who he's going to, they could maybe develop him down the line. But their 4 linebackers right now are Dean Morrow, Sean Bradley, he didn't play. Sean Bradley played 0 snaps in the regular defense last year.
Special just a lot of time, period.
Yeah. And then Christian Ellis, who is good on special teams, but like, come on. So like they're going to add another linebacker at some point that can play in the regular defense, to be determined if that's a starting caliber player or just sort of another depth guy.
Jim, do you expect the other side just to hit the ground running offensively? I know you mentioned Sayamalu, and that, I don't want to minimize that, but still, there's tons of talent on that side. How good are they? Are they better in your estimation? Do you think? Or
we'll see how much better even Jalen Hurts can get from last year into this year. It'll become, the polish to his game is only going to keep getting better and better. The concern for him will be get down, man. Unless it's like a high leverage situation, make sure you're staying healthy, get out of bounds, slide, whatever you got to do, because the kind of money that they're paying him now, you can't afford to get that guy hurt, obviously. But AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, there's just so much star power, in the passing game. And then obviously it's the best offensive, even with the loss of Isaac Seumalo, it's still very clearly the best offensive line in the NFL. And I'm kind of interested to see how this running back rotation comes along too, because you trade for DeAndre Swift during the draft. You sign who I think is an awesome running back in Rashad Penny, with the huge caveat when healthy, because man, like his injury history is insane,
lengthy.
But when he plays, he is awesome. Like he averaged, 6.1 yards per carry before he broke his leg last year. He's a 220-pound power back, but who can also run away from defensive backs when he gets into the open field. So the way that I look at it is I feel like DeAndre Swift is a more talented running back than Miles Sanders, but with a similar caveat as Rashad Penny. Can he stay healthy? And then I think Rashad Penny is also a more talented back than Miles Sanders. Can you have those 2 guys combined be more durable than Miles Sanders? And if you can, I think that's the one position on this roster that you look at and you go, that could be a big upgrade if those 2 guys, can the 2 of them combined, if they can stay healthy. And then of course you have Kenny Gainwell, who made a step forward last year, and Boston Scott is always around to just kind of, haunt the Giants.
Well, go ahead, Derek.
Let me ask you this, Jimmy. Who do you think will be the biggest threat to the Eagles in their division this year?
It's the Cowboys.
You think the Cowboys?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're not only the biggest threat to them in the division, but I actually think they're also better than the 49ers. So they made 2 moves this offseason that I think are, a huge help to some of their deficiencies last year. One being, they traded for Brandon Cooks. They made a big mistake trading Amari Cooper for basically nothing to the Browns. And, they made a similar trade to bring Brandon Cooks back. If you take those 2 trades and you kind of, merge them together, it doesn't look great. But if you just look at the Brandon Cooks deal on its in a vacuum, I thought it was a good deal. And they needed a guy that could kind of stretch the field, because they had CeeDee Lamb and they had nothing else. Like they were hoping Michael Gallup would be fine coming off a serious injury from the year before. He didn't. He might be, a little better this year than he was last year, but they really needed a second receiver to kind of take some of the attention away from CeeDee Lamb. And Brandon Cooks, for all the times that he's been traded over the course of his career, and there's got to be something to that in terms of his personality or whatever. There can't just be nothing where all these teams just keep trading him away.
Yeah, really.
But there's no doubt that he's talented. He puts together productive seasons, year after year after year. So him combined with CeeDee Lamb is a it's a big step forward for them. And then on the defensive side of the ball, they traded for Stephon Gilmore, who is still a really good player. In fact, that even got the attention of AJ Brown after they made that trade. AJ Brown, of course, the Eagles, of course, faced the Colts last year, who Stephon Gilmore played for, and AJ Brown was impressed with him after that game, and he was like, "Okay, now it's on." And they traded for Stephon Gilmore because they had a hole at that second cornerback spot opposite Trayvon Diggs. So yeah, I think they got stronger both at cornerback and wide receiver, which were two problem areas for them last year.
How the McCarthy factor, though, has got to come into play here, right, Jim? I mean, they move on from Kellen Moore. He's calling the play. There's even more responsibility on him now. We know in big spots, he doesn't always come up big. That's the thing I wonder about. You're right about the talent, but is there that McCarthy thing? And let's face it, Dak mentally, that was a tough year, man. The amount of pick sixes and interceptions generally for him last year was way up there.
Yeah, the McCarthy thing, to start with that, he had some asinine quote where he was like, in regard to Kellen Moore, all Kellen Moore wanted to do was score points. He's like, I want to win games. Well, yeah, okay, that's his job, is to score points. So, he wants to win these defensive struggles. He wants to run the ball a lot, it seems, and he wants to put the the game in the hands of his defense, which, I don't know. It's just not how the NFL is that's not how it goes these days. But yeah, it's a weird quote by him. And I think that, he's had some, big mistakes in big moments in the playoffs in recent years, notably that crazy call that he made with, the Dak Prescott draw, where he tried to run and slide and get up and spike the ball for another shot on the whatever. What was the other part of that question?
And Dak, just kind of where Dak
is
coming off of the amount of interceptions and pick sixes too, which was, at a high rate last year.
Yeah. I mean, throughout his entire career, he's had stacked offenses all around him. In the early days, he had, when, before Zeke Elliott had sort of fallen off a cliff, he, largely carried that offense. Their offensive line was always one of the best in the NFL. Their offensive line has kind of aged, and they've lost some guys like, Tyron Smith is certainly not the player he was, 4 or 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. They lost La'el Collins by choice, but he's not there anymore. They've drafted guys along the interior of their offensive line that they haven't totally panned out. Travis Frederick is a guy who retired at some point during those spans, and they had stacked wide receiver groups like the aforementioned Amari Cooper. Was a big time player for them, obviously. So he always had great talent around him. And then heading into last year, I thought that was the worst supporting cast that he had ever had in his career. And sure enough, he threw a lot of interceptions, and some of them weren't his fault. A lot of them, were balls that bounced off receivers' hands. Like the one really devastating interception that he had was in the Jaguars game. I think it was overtime, or was certainly late in that game. It was basically a walk-off where he threw a pick six in that game. And that actually helped out the Eagles big time, because otherwise it'd have been some really, if Dallas had won that game, the Eagles, the division would have come down to an Eagles-Dallas game late in that year, or I forget exactly how that went. But and that was a huge loss for the Cowboys, and Eagles dodged the bullet by them having that pick or whatever. But anyway, like I mentioned, I think that the addition of Cooks is going to help. I think the loss of Ezekiel Elliott, assuming they don't bring him back, they could very well still sign him and bring him back after they cut him. But I think him being gone is a good thing, because they were over reliant on him, and he is clearly is deep into decline. And when you have a guy like Tony Pollard back there, who's more of a dual threat, both as a runner and through the air, and more dynamic player at the stages of their respective careers, I think it's a more potent offense this year than it was last year. And a big part of their success obviously is going to be if Dak can bounce back from his work. I thought that was the worst season of his career, of course, with the worst supporting cast around him of his career.
No question.
But he's a guy. He's a guy. One last thing, like he's a guy that you can win a Super Bowl with, but I don't know that he's a guy that you win a Super Bowl because of.
Yeah, he straight carries you. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Mm.
Hey, Jimmy, we sit here and we agree in unison that this Eagles offense should be electric, and we also agree that there's a lot of question marks about this defense. But it is still, and I agree with you 100%. I still think it is the most talented roster in the NFC. Mm-hmm. But is it a 14-win roster when you consider the depth of this schedule they face this year? And obviously, we just speculate now, but it is a crazy schedule this year.
Yeah, it's Dallas, and then the bye, and then who do they get? The Chiefs.
Yeah, Chiefs,
Bills,
and then in Buffalo.
Yeah,
Niners.
Yeah,
Cowboys, and then Cowboys road, and then Seahawks road.
Yeah, it's at Chiefs, home Bills, home Niners, at Cowboys, at Seattle, home Giants.
Brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those two road games back to back. I think that Seattle game is kind of like a little under the radar in that stretch of games too, because it's at the tail end of it, and you'd fly to Dallas, you come back, you fly to Seattle, and you play. And that team, like, obviously they don't have Russell Wilson anymore. Russell Wilson, tormented the Eagles anytime they played them. He's gone, and he's not good anymore, really. But so it's a totally different team that they'll be facing in Seattle. But for whatever reason, they've lost to that team like 7 straight times. And really have always had trouble whenever they've gone up to Seattle. But having those 2 road games back to back is at the tail end of that stretch is brutal.
The last one for me, Jim. I think the New England game is going to be more of a challenge than people are chalking it up to. It's sort of like, oh, they stink, but it's the first game. It's there. A lot of time to prep for Belichick, at least early emotions, because it's Brady retirement night. Like there's a Bill O'Brien factor. Maybe he gets Mac Jones back on track. I think that one's a little tricky.
Yeah, you never know what you're going to get sometimes when there's a coaching change during the offseason. You're not certain like what offense they're going to run with there's plenty of tape on Bill O'Brien from when he coached in the NFL with the Texans or whoever. So you have an idea of what he's going to do, but when you put him with a totally new set of personnel, you're not totally sure what he's going to do. So it's hard to game plan for guys like that. And conversely, it'll be maybe a little more difficult to game plan for them to game plan for a new defensive coordinator and Sean Desai. So I don't know, maybe that evens out or whatever, but their defense is really good. New Orleans, like they were number 3 in, Football Outsiders DVOA metric a year ago. Their offense was just awful. So they are good on the one side of the ball if they can get things figured out, and Bill O'Brien can, work some magic there, obviously under Matt, now Eagles,
weird
assistant
Jim.
coach.
That's a weird hiring. No?
It really was. With Matt Patricia was kind of a disaster for them on the offensive side of the ball last year. So I don't know. We'll see if they're better or not. But I think when you're talking about playing on the road week 1 against the team that is coached by, let's be honest, like I think that maybe Bill Belichick's legacy has been hurt a little bit by the success that Tom Brady has had without him and the lack of success that he has had after Tom Brady left. But let's be honest, like that guy is still obviously one of the best head coaches of all time, and have to face that guy week 1 is certainly going to be a challenge.
No question. Well, Jim, listen, thanks, man. We always enjoy talking with you, and I read you every day, man. And I tell
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Likewise,
follow you
bro.
on Twitter at Jimmy Kempski, and does an amazing job for the Philly Voice. And there's all kinds of good stuff. I mean, you it was earlier this morning. You touched on the emergency quarterback rule, what it means for the Eagles, and I'm always checking out what you have going on. So, Jim, appreciate it, man. Thanks for a couple minutes.
Thanks,
Thank you, Jimmy.
All right,
appreciate
take care.
Brother.
That's
Take
Jimmy
care.
Kempski, Philly Voice. Love catching up with Jimmy. 1:30, Derek. We'll have Ben Davis, Phillies analyst, in both in the booth and in the studio. So we'll catch up with Ben on everything baseball wise. All right, when we come back. By the way, at 2:00. And don't think we've forgotten about. We continue the GOATs, Derek. We go on the defensive side of the ball.
I'm ready. I'm going to surprise you with one. I know I'm going to surprise you with one.
I like it. We go DN, D tackle, corner, safety, linebacker, greatest to ever play in the NFL. That's going to be fun. But we're going to do a bunch of other stuff with the NFL at 2:00. And like I mentioned, Ben at 1:30. We'll come back. We'll go a little bit harder into the Sixers candidates here for coaches. Okay. Nick Nurse, who's reportedly getting interviewed this week, Mike Budenholzer, Monty Williams. If you want to throw Frank Vogel in there, Mike D'Antoni, we'll get into all those guys. when we come back. So don't go anywhere. He's Derek Gunn. I'm Rob Ellis. We are Sports Take, JAKIB Sports YouTube Network. Let's talk about Jim Murray and Principal Financial Group, because finding that right person, finding that person that you can trust with your hard-earned money that could in a lot of ways determine your future is enormous, right? And I found that right person with Jim Murray and Principal Financial Group, whether it's 401k review, retirement planning, not really, thrilled with your situation with insurance. You might have a small business. You're trying to get employee benefits off the ground. It's another resource that Jim can help you with. I know personally, I've entrusted my IRA, my 401k rollover to Jim, and I couldn't be any happier. You will be too. Give him a call, 610-996-4751, 610-996-4751. You can also email him as well, Murray, Murray, .jim@principal.com.